Welcome to my channel. The colors we're using today are Hansa Yellow Light, Naphthol Red, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, Yellow Ochre, Ivory Black, and Titanium White, along with Liquid is the medium. So we're going to dip this number 4 brush into some liquid and then Burnt Sienna to sketch out the drawing. This is an 11 by 14 canvas panel, which I've already pre-stained with a little bit of burnt sienna. I'm going to work on a beach scene today. This will give us a chance to work on our skies, water, as well as some rocks and sand. So this should help you with a lot of your landscape paintings on the beach. This form here is going to be a rock, which will be part of our focal point. So here I'm just mapping in the scene. Be some distant rocks, and then this foreground cliff. Working on the tonal values. This will be a little bit darker, of course, with this cliff that's in the foreground. At this point, I'm painting very loosely with a lot of Gamsol. That's odorless mineral spirits, and just burnt sienna. So this is a very thin layer of paint, because most of this I'm going to cover back up. Today I'm working on my imagination, no photo reference. Here I'm just making a note that this is where the sand will be a little bit darker because the water is touching this part of the sand often. And then the lightest part of the sand, of course, is going to be the driest part of the sand. And so I'm leaving that with just the underpainting at this point. Notice there's no detail at this point. I'm just trying to determine the composition. So the focal point is going to be at the top third of the painting, with that one large rock. But I still want some areas of interest in the lower third as well as the middle third as well. Here, making a darker dark by mixing in ultramarine blue with my burnt sienna. Notice I don't have to make another pile of color. I'm just mixing that color right into the original pile of color that was already on the palette. This is a full box easel, by the way, a Maybath. I'm just now putting in some of the darkest darks that I see in the foreground cliff. Trying to vary the brush strokes. You want variety in your painting, so You don't want to have similar brush strokes, and you want to avoid as many patterns as possible. In other words, making the same stroke or the same image or the same distance away from each other, that kind of thing. Any kind of pattern like that will make your paintings look less realistic. This is an impressionistic painting. Of course, there's a lot of leeway in terms of what you may desire as impressionistic work or expressive work. When I think of that term, I'm thinking about the fact that I want some areas of detail, but I really want a kind of painterly feel to this work. And so you can achieve that by squinting if you were looking at an actual reference, if you were painting from life, or even if you were painting from a photograph, you could use some squinting to take out the detail and then copy what you see. In this case, I'm using my imagination. And so I'm consciously reminding myself not to put a lot of detail in. So here I've lightened that mixture with a little bit of titanium white. Because these colors set back in for those hills and cliff areas. And I'm allowing some of that burnt sienna to come through. Just using the same brush. And some of this is going to be covered over as well. Just focusing on getting as much down on the panel as I possibly can to start with. One of the key things you want to look at is making sure that you're applying paint all over the painting at the start, and that you're not trying to finish one little section. You're wanting to really bring the entire painting together at the very end. So the first goal is to block in and getting a basic level, or at least a mid value of each of these color tones on the canvas as quickly as possible. So here with that mixture, just basically adding a little bit more titanium white and some yellow ochre. I'm thinking about the sand where the water comes in, touching it, keeping it nice and moist and wet. This is the area where the kids love to build their sand castles, right? And so I'm just quickly sketching that color in. Once again, this is a very light layer of paint, so not a whole lot of paint. Still using some Gamsol at this point to produce that. Well, that color is a little bit too dark. It won't stay that way for very long. I just want to get it covered, and I can always manipulate the color. There you go. I've put a little bit more titanium white because I want that, of course, to sit back a little bit further, creating the illusion of some distance. And now I'm lightening a few areas on that rock formation as well, which sits off the coast in this imaginary world. it's nice sometimes to paint without any kind of a reference. You can get right into it and you can change it up however you wish. And when you're doing that from your imagination, one of the goals that I'm at least thinking about is I want it to seem realistic without necessarily being photorealistic. So I'm just having fun with it. But I do hope that the viewers will look at it and think, oh, I wonder where this is. Here, just some titanium white being mixed into that mixture now, which had primarily yellow ochre. And this is going to be my lighter sand. The parts of the sand where the water does not touch, where the waves are ending, where the hot sun is evaporating that moisture, if there was any. So here clearly you can see that cliff in the foreground area is much oranger than what you see in the distant rocks, and that helps, I believe, to produce that illusion that I want in terms of perspective. I'm going to finish up the sand here, and then we'll start working on the water and the sky areas, which are going to be predominantly blue mixtures with the ultramarine blue. Sometimes the clip holders themselves can become quite an obstacle. I feel like I'm always turning them to get the position to make sure I've got paint behind them. One thing you can do, especially if you're in a home studio, to help see the colors correctly is do what I've done and hang a curtain behind it, especially if you got like a window or other things that produce some light that may cast shadows on your painting surface. You don't want that, so having a curtain behind it such that the light is shining from the front can be a major help when you are painting in the studio. You'll also want to make sure that your light bulbs are the kind that will kind of reproduce a natural light. And of course, you certainly don't want light bulbs that emit a shade of light that's too blue. So you're looking more for a natural bulb. You may want to simply experiment on your own with a few different bulbs to see what type of light works the best in the particular room that you're using. I know for myself that has varied depending on the place that I had set up the studio. So I don't want to suggest to you that there's one particular type bulb with a particular wattage, because there's just no such thing. Your space is going to be so much different than mine. There are a lot of videos out there where you're going to find other people advising you exactly what wattage, where to align things, but unless they've actually lived in your home, I don't know how helpful that's really going to be. So I would just start off with the light bulbs that you have there and see how well that light looks after you've painted the painting as a kind of a practice, and then go and purchase a few different bulbs and just experiment with painting with that light. I would say, though, of course, that curtains to keep the light out from certain windows, if they're providing a shadow on your painting surface, that's what you want to eliminate. This is a good time. We're about 15 minutes into this painting to remind you that if you like the content on the channel, please subscribe and give a thumbs up. That would really help me out. In the feedback I've had so far from many of you, you appreciate the real time as well as the mixing of some of the colors to be able to see that right on the palette, where I'm now mixing an aqua blue color using some of the Hansa yellow light, ultramarine blue, and then of course titanium white, and then liquid. Titanium white is a color that really dries slowly, so you may want to add in some extra liquid in your titanium white before you even introduce that into other mixtures in your painting. Now this part here is not the sky, this is actually water. So I'm imagining a scene in which, as you look out towards this structure, this mountain structure that's in the actually off the coast, you can see the ocean water behind it. And so there's just going to be a little bit of sky today in this painting. So that's pretty much the line I'm going to establish for the water, providing some interest. And then above that line that I'm painting here now will be the sky. Right now it looks very light green. One thing that you need to remember is that until you have all the painting covered with its first block in, it will be impossible to judge the colors next to each other. So reserve judgment until you really have covered the canvas. So that color will change as you see me apply some ultramarine blue and titanium white for the sky. Clean my brushes just with some Bounty towels, and then I've also have the Gamsol. I'm primarily using two brushes today. One is for my lights and the other one's from the darks. One's a 4 and the other is a 6 that I'm using. I may also, I do believe you'll also see me use a number 2 fan brush. So here I'm using titanium white, the liquid, and then a little bit of the ultramarine blue. And so now I'm just going to vary my brush strokes and start painting from the top. I will leave a gap between these two colors, between the ocean and the sky, so that way it doesn't look like what I call a flag, where you feel like you've got stripes on the flag. I will leave some parts untouched with paint, and I will come back in, as you'll see in just a little bit, and I'll actually take a dry brush and work on softening the line between these two, between the sky and the sea. And I'm also leaving parts open for some clouds. And that's where the underpainting of the burnt sienna is really helpful, is I want a little bit of that orange to come through, providing some more warmth. I will also be mixing in with that white cloud color. I'm going to take a little bit of the Hansa yellow light and mix that into my titanium white and liquid in order to produce warm clouds, rather than, you certainly don't want to just use titanium white straight out of the tube for your clouds. It's just way too cold. And then of course you can't go any lighter than that color. So there's the titanium white. Start off with a little bit of the yellow ochre to warm that cloud color. And then I do believe I'm going to there we go. The Hansa yellow light. I'm going to take just a little bit of that. Always start small with your mixtures. You can always add more color in if it's not enough, but you can never go backwards, obviously. You can't remove the color from it once you put it in, so be very careful that you're adding just a little bit of color at a time. And now I'm not really worried about trying to get a final stroke for the clouds right now. I'm just working on putting that color in the areas that I left intentionally for it. So I'm just varying the brush strokes. I'm putting still very light coloring. There's not a lot of paint on the brush at this point. And so that's intentional because it'll make it easier for me if I need to come over top of these colors with more paint. And it may not show up quite dramatically on the video, but those clouds should look more yellowy than titanium white does, obviously, right? And notice how those colors and the way that I'm painting here, whoop, major crash. I didn't have those clips in very snug on the panel. Sometimes you paid a price for that. Thankfully, I didn't ruin the painting here. It didn't fall completely on the ground or into my palette, thankfully. All right, I think I'm ready to go again. Push that one in and tighten it up a little bit. So I'm just putting that light color in, and of course, it's a very thin layer of paint, and if I pick up too much color from the ocean color or the sky color, I'll wipe it off and then reapply the cloud color, so that way I don't end up with a bunch of dirty color up in the sky. That's certainly where you don't want a mixture of mud. And now, you can't really see me, but I'm just kind of flicking the paint around with that dry brush. So I removed as much paint as I could, and now I'm actually blurring the line between the clouds and the ocean. And then I'm doing it again with a couple of horizontal strokes here, which are essentially removing paint rather than putting paint on. See how that creates a little bit of a blend, and it's become a little harder to see where the ocean ends and the sky begins with the clouds. Now here I'm taking those rough edges of the clouds and basically moving the paint around with this dry brush so it's a much softer line. And that's the effect that I wanted to have here. Not really thinking about it, just letting the brush do the work. And I'm just trying to vary it enough that I don't end up with any kind of pattern. I want it to look as natural as possible. And by natural, we're talking chaos, right? We're talking allowing the brush to kind of go where it wants to, so that way I'm not even consciously thinking about repeating any kind of stroke. So relatively happy with what that upper third section looks like at this point. And the only way you'll know that is sometimes you'll see me stand up what I'm doing is I'm walking to the back of the room, taking a look at the composition, looking at the values and the shapes, and if that's acceptable, I'll come back in and fix what I saw. So here I'm taking that dry brush and just reestablishing a bit of that line. You'll notice too that I'm working from darks to lights. So we started with our browns with the sketch in, and now we're turning to the very lightest lights. Now here, mix your titanium white, ultramarine blue, a little bit of Hansa yellow to create an aqua color. So remember to save yourself some grief by spending quite a bit of time making sure that the color is correct on your palette. Now I will admit sometimes it's hard to see that, and I will mix the mixture where I think it needs to be, apply a little bit of it on the canvas panel, and then go from there. If I need to, I'll scratch it out, I'll mix the color, and reapply it if need be. And once again, there's the part of the canvas that hasn't been painted yet. That is going to become the tides, the ocean coming into this beach. Had to take a little bit of a break in the actual painting process here, so there we go. Always good to take a look at how the painting is progressing, and to see it from a distance is really the only way you can do that. And now I'm visually comparing this color to the watercolor that is in the upper 1/3 near the sky. This color needs to be a little bit warmer, and so I'm starting to judge it, but not by much. And I think you can sort of tell that. It certainly needs to look somewhat like the color that we have behind that landmass that's sticking out there in the ocean a little bit further from the shore. And here's the parts where we're going to see the blue. And so I'm consciously leaving some parts unpainted in between, because I'm going to come back in with the lightest color, which is going to be the waves. And those waves are going to be composed mainly of titanium white and just a little hint of color using Hansa yellow light. But not much. I want the whites to be even whiter than the clouds. And it's one of the few times that you see that in the landscape, is that you'll actually have a color that's lighter than the clouds. And that is from the waves crashing into the shoreline. Squeezing out a few more colors. It's always good to make sure that you've got enough color on your palette. One mistake I see a lot of beginners use is that they don't put enough paint out. And if you're only painting with small blobs, what's going to happen is you're going to skimp on the paint. And you really don't want to do that. You want to try to paint like you're a millionaire and not be afraid of applying some thick paint, especially as you get closer to the foreground. Here you'll notice I'm painting with the side of the brush. So I'm not painting up and down. I'm painting crosswise. east to west with that little bit warmer mixture of the titanium white with just a little hint of Hansa yellow. And then I'm trying my best to not obliterate the blue, the aqua blue colors that I already put down just a few minutes ago that you saw me put in. And when you're at a distance and there's a lot of waves coming in, you really don't see a lot of the blue. You see a lot more of the white, which is something that you kind of have to view yourself and remember. This is from my imagination, so you could essentially do your ocean as whatever way you want to, but keep in mind that you actually don't see dramatic waves when you're this far out viewing a scene. If you want more texture, then you're going to want probably a different composition to allow for more detail. Here, I just need the illusion of some waves crashing into the shore. And that can be performed by just a few brush strokes with the color changes. Think about when you've visited a shoreline or a little cove, and think about if there's a lot of waves coming in, there's quite a bit of white that you're seeing and not as much color. And that's kind of what I'm using for my visual, as I'm thinking about times in which I've been at the beach, not using a reference photo, but thinking about how it felt. If I had to be pressed upon what part of the country then am I envisioning, I'm thinking about the coastline that I observed in Maine, where the water is very cold most of the year. Even in the summertime, the water is pretty cold. Here, as I'm getting closer to the foreground, I'm deciding to pull my brush strokes down more, which is just a small detail, but will give the impression that these waves are closer and a little bit more dramatic than the ones in the distance. Here I'm just remembering that these waves are going right into that shoreline, and so I want to kind of make sure that I don't end up with a lot of straight lines in that coastline, because that's not the effect that you actually see. This is more or less where you get the blending of colors, water coming in and going back out quickly. So I'm trying to capture that illusion. And notice not using a ton of paint today. Especially, this is still the block in. A few more strokes and then the whole canvas will have been filled. And then we can start working on some of the details. And there you have it. That's the block in. And now I can begin to adjust all of my values and colors. A few observations I'm making now is that the red that's on the cliff that's in the foreground is just too red. So I need to adjust that. Putting a few notes of maybe a distant wave in the very very far background there. Of course, those strokes would be on the horizontal plane. And here I'm thinking about some of the water coming up and staying on this sand, and just adding a few loose brush strokes to indicate that. Some have asked what video software do I use to make these videos. I use LumaFusion. Now, I do not use a bunch of special effects with these videos. I'm really aiming to show you the process. Other artists will often do this and not in real time, but speed it up, cut out a lot of the brush strokes so you don't see everything that the artist is doing, and they will add in some scenes, some B-roll footage, and that kind of thing. I prefer something really simple, so other than making sure that the easel is set up correctly and not wobbling, my studio provides good lighting. I think it's a little easier to see the painting process this way. I could just as easily do this outdoors with the plein air event, but I just think that it's more helpful, I think, for you to be able to really see what I'm working on. And outdoors, there's other complications that sometimes play into it in terms of trying to videotape your painting process. But back to the software. So LumaFusion is available now for the Mac, for the iPad, and even Chromebooks. The Chromebook has to have the latest generation Intel processor. That would be generation 11. And it needs to be at least an i3 Intel processor. That, by the way, is what I have. I have a Lenovo Chromebook. It's an i3 processor, and it works amazingly well. This is kind of the middle of the road. It costs about $300 for this Chromebook, and has about a 256 hard drive on it with 8 gigabytes of RAM. And of course, I can use external storage. I actually think that this is easier to do on this Chromebook than it was on any of the iPads, even the more advanced iPads. Partly because of the storage restrictions on some of those. So now I'm going back in with a few more darks. The LumaFusion software itself is relatively inexpensive. It's another reason to use it. And it has a lot of capabilities. Like I mentioned, my own style of producing these is more focused on the actual image that I'm painting. So I don't often do a lot with titles or filters. Of course, I want you to be able to see the real color, so I'm certainly not going to be experimenting with a lot of filters. And then, of course, for the commentary, the LumaFusion allows me to just do a voiceover. I'll delete all the original music that I was listening to or whatever was going on in the background, and then take an additional time to do the voiceover. There are times in which I think I could probably edit out some of my painting strokes, but what I continue to hear from a lot of you is that you would prefer me to leave that in so that this was a real-time video and that you could basically see every stroke that I'm putting down, even if I end up taking a stroke out or covering it up later. And I've come to see this, especially these videos, as almost performance art. And by the way, these paintings I do sell, which is kind of special, I think, too, for those that are purchasing the painting. These are original oil paintings, 11 by 14s, and then not only do you have the painting, but you have the capacity to download the video and keep that, show it to your friends, or at least be able to reference that and actually see your painting being made by me in real time, and then have the painting on the wall. I think that's kind of a neat thing. Other artists are also doing this, whether it be plein air or in the studio, and suggesting some of the benefits of that process of being able to have the artist telling you what they're thinking and how they're painting your painting, and then also to be able to have the finished project. I am using Utrecht oils. These are the professional Utrecht oils. You can purchase them from Blick's Art Supplies. I use a limited palette of colors, as you see. 3 colors that are predominantly earth tones: burnt sienna, yellow ochre. I do have ivory black on my palette. I must admit that I keep finding things that I could use that for, and then I don't use it. Some of the impressionists did not use ivory black, others did. Recently I learned that Sargent actually had ivory black on his palette, so I think that's a pretty good company to keep if Sargent had that on his palette. I never use ivory black straight out of the tube, and certainly it's more of a color used for your mixtures to perhaps tone down some colors. It also makes some wonderful greens, by the way, when you mix it with your yellows. So here I've covered up that obnoxious red. I feel this is much better tone at this point. There's a little bit of a shadow of these cliffs on the sand below, so I'm putting that in. Or there would be. So I'm thinking from my imagination on this. That's probably the biggest struggle when you're painting from your imagination, is the colors. You're obviously not trying to match colors that you see in any kind of a reference. That can free you to expand your color palette and to use some colors that you wouldn't necessarily put together. At the same time, you do want there to be some semblance of reality. I mean, this is a landscape, and so you want people to be able to look at it and think, oh, that could certainly be something that's found in the real world. Here, I'm thinking about how the sun is striking these cliffs, and adding the light with a mixture of yellow ochre and titanium white. And one of the things that's so interesting is that that's really a far cry from being very light. Look how dark that is comparison actually to the white foam of the waves. And here notice that I'm applying paint on top of wet paint. And so in order to do that most effectively, you have to have more paint on your brush. So these strokes are going on with more liquid and more paint off of the palette. So we're not using any Gamsol or mineral spirits at this point to weaken the color or the amount of paint. We're now getting into much thicker paint. Just trying to provide some variety too. Anytime you see a big patch of just one color, that's a good place to find some ways to get the same tonal value, but to add some color. A painting becomes rather boring if there's a big, just a big section where it's all the same color. Even if it's sand, it needs some variety. And I'll show you that here in a few minutes. Here, just going back and reestablishing some of the darks. Now that might look like ivory black, but it's actually a mixture of the ultramarine blue and the burnt sienna. Here my struggle is I don't want these darks to be so dark that they compete for the focal point. However, they have to be dark enough to convince you that they are in the foreground, that they're closer to you, so that it will lend itself to pushing back the rest of the painting. So now I'm stepping back, taking a good look at the painting. What does it need? What adjustments need to be made still? And the only way you can sometimes see that is making sure that you're backing up, because you're not going to be, the viewer is not going to be right on top of the painting looking at each of those little spots. They're going to see it, hopefully, almost the room away, and be drawn to take a closer look. But that closer look is going to be several feet from the painting. So here, I'm actually taking a round brush. And remember how I said we want to break up any large masses of color? So I'm imagining that there's going to be some sticks, some stones, maybe some seashells that can break up the monotony of some of those colors. And so I'm just gently applying a few of these little marks to give a sense of detail. And I think it's always amazing as you apply some of these to take a step back for a moment and see what the brain does with that. The brain sees that and thinks, yeah, that could be a rock. That's a rock on the shore, sure. Or that's a seashell. Yeah, that. So your mind is interpreting these little pieces of paint as being detail, when in fact you just saw I
I've just applied a little piece of paint, that's it. But the brain is telling you that's a rock, that's a seashell. So you as an artist want to take advantage of that. It's a way of painting detail without painting detail. The other thing, and you'll notice that I make a mistake here, is that you can get so into painting these little specks of color that you start creating some patterns or you add too much. Now the nice thing about oils, I can go back in and basically erase those without any trouble at all. And you will see me at some point decide that, you know what, it looks like there's too many freckles on the beach. We need to get rid of some of those freckles so that the mind sees them as little details, but we don't want too many little details, or that becomes a little bit monotonous and uninteresting. And it's always hard to figure out exactly when that occurs. Now here, this is just a cheap little brush I picked up in a package of cheap little brushes. It's a synthetic bristle. I do believe it was capable of all media. At least that's what it said on the little package. I think I got it at Walmart or someplace. But it's just a great brush to come in over top of the other layer. I'm able to get a plenty of paint on this brush, and it's got a sharp enough edge at this point still that I can take that additional paint and apply it. So I'm now working at making sure that there's a few little details, little highlights of where the sun might be hitting, and I've added a little bit different tone of color to indicate that. And then on what I'm calling that discovery point, that little group of rocks that's just off the coast, you'll notice that I've put a couple of horizontal lines on the very top, or where maybe sun is shining down on it, so that becomes a little bit lighter. And then by doing that, it actually makes the other part of the painting darker right away because of the contrast. And that also can really help your paintings take on some life. Also add a few of those details in the foreground on that cliff to suggest where some light is being reflected back. Now here, another yellow ochre with some burnt sienna and titanium white mixed in, as I work to push a few of those colors back. And to also make sure that that shoreline doesn't look too uniformed. I want that level of some chaos. Acts of nature rather than acts of man, I think. Charlie Hunter uses that phrase. I like that phrase. He talks about Charlie Hunter is a plein air painter. He does his paintings in basically two colors, I think. He uses Cobra water mixable oils, and often with buildings, but when he does nature scenes, he talks about the fact that acts of nature have to be really random. And then, of course, if it's a building, it's an act of man, so you're looking for a lot of sharp edges there. But in this landscape where there are no man-made structures, we're really making sure that each of the there shouldn't be any real lines. We want to present soft edges almost throughout the painting. Of course, when you do have hard edges, you're basically telling the viewer, hey, look here. And so that may be okay on where the focal point's going to be. But you don't want too many of those in other places of the painting, or it's going to call too much attention to them. So here, what I'm hoping to do, and I think that the painting is progressing in this way, is that your eye is being pulled to that little outbreak, the mountains or the cliffs, if you want to call it that, that are sitting right off the shore. That's the focal point. Everything else is designed to get you there. And it's what I would call an O composition, with one exception. You're actually coming in from the right along that seashore, and then you're driven up kind of in an O fashion to those rocks in the middle of the painting on the top third, and then the foam on the right hand side is taking you back. So it's a complete circle, and there are some places of interest around the circle, the cliffs. There's that difference of some rocks that are in the middle there of the painting, the second 2/3 there, and then that cliff of rocks at the very top.
Now, as the painting gets to this stage, the other thing I'm thinking about is that I don't want to ruin it. This is where you really have to slow down the painting process and think about only adding things that hopefully will add to the painting. But it's so easy to add too much, to go overboard. And then the brushstrokes don't look as spontaneous. It doesn't look as painterly. It looks more labored. Now hopefully here, at least I was pleased with the painting, that it looks pretty loose, and yet there's enough detail. Now here, another technique you can use is to just use your finger to take out some things that you want to leave out. And so some of those little dots I thought got way too monotonous. They're too big for one thing, because you're looking at such a far distance away in this composition that you don't want to make those look like polka dots or something on the seashore. So I'll take and erase a few more of those, I do believe. But otherwise, I'm pretty happy with it at this point in time. How does one price an artwork? That's another question that I hear a lot. My advice is to do it by square inch. So for example, an 11 by 14, you just times those together, and you're going to get, at $1 a square foot, you're going to get a price of $154. This keeps it, your prices related to the size, which makes sense, rather than how you feel about a particular piece. There have been many times in which I thought that a particular painting I did was much better than others, and so I would just price it higher.
because I like the piece. And some artists do that from time to time, especially. But I was always surprised that in some cases, the paintings that I thought were worth more, others did not see that. And part of it's because you fall in love with your own painting process. And sometimes you fall in love with the process so much that you may think that the painting's better because of your experience on that day of painting. And so to keep yourself away from attaching emotion to some of your works, pricing them all by the square inch really helps. So that way every 11 by 14, for example, at $1 a square inch would be $154. So that takes the guesswork out. Let the buyer determine which particular painting he or she wants to own and pay the $154 for it, rather than the constant adjusting. I know others that will want to try to do some kind of an hourly rate, as if, okay, I put in X number of hours, so that way I'm going to, I just don't think that works very well. There are some paintings that never really turn out that great, but I may have worked on them for countless hours, far too long. Doesn't necessarily mean that that painting is worth that much money, though. So I would discourage you from trying to paint and get paid for a finished painting by the hour or any other metric that you could use. So keep it simple, per square foot. Whether your rate could be $1, it could be $1.50. If you're really advanced, it could be $3, $4, per square inch. I would not increase your prices until you're really selling. Start low is always best, and then move up. Maybe a slight increase each year that you're painting as you get better at the craft. That's what I've heard other artists say, and that's what I attempt to do. And my philosophy when I started out was always, I'd rather sell a lot of paintings, even if they're lower in price, than to sell nothing and to start way too high and then have all of these paintings sitting in a cabinet somewhere, gathering dust, when you know full well you're not going to sell them. Because as you get better, those older paintings become less valuable, really. And so just keep that in mind. And it's also, I think, art at any level is about momentum. And so I always felt much better about my own painting to have people want to purchase the painting, even if it was for a rather small fee. Another way that you could price your paintings, I suppose, is to go on Etsy, go on eBay, go on some of the places that sell paintings, and compare your artwork to those that are being sold. Now, not the ones that aren't selling, but the paintings that are actually selling. And see what those artists are charging, and then you can kind of extrapolate, how much per square inch you should be charging for your paintings. Are your paintings really as good as artist ABC? And if not, you may want to go back to the drawing board in terms of how much you're pricing your paintings at. Now, why is it important to really be consistent in your payment structure for paintings? Well, the worst thing you do is to sell a painting at one level, say $200, and then you start selling your paintings at $75. The person who paid the $200, how do you think they're going to feel about the artwork? Probably not that good. They're going to feel like you ripped them off if you're now selling all of your works at $75 a piece. So you got to keep that in mind, that once you go to a certain high level, you need to stay there. Otherwise, if you have collectors, collectors expect that the prices are going to go up over time, but they don't want to see them go down, because you're basically telling those collectors the value of my work is going down, not up. That's not something you want to be known for. You also don't want to be known as a really cheap artist either. When I was first starting out, one of the things I noticed was that some of my originals were about the price of some really good artist prints. And that made some sense to me at the time. Wouldn't you rather have an original artwork, even if it's from a different artist, than a print of a famous artist, but it's just a print? It's not the real show. It's not the real deal. So if you can buy a $75 print from someone, think about it that way. Well, isn't my original worth $75? Maybe that's a good starting price. There's a lot of philosophy about sizes of paintings these days and what sells. Keep in mind that most people do not buy a lot of really large paintings. And so I think that a good size to start with that you can do in the studio as well as in plein air, 11 by 14. Obviously, that's one of the reasons you see me paint on these all the time. And 12 by 16. And maybe some 16 by 20s. People are more apt to buy the smaller work. For one thing, it's going to be a cheaper price starting out with. It gives you experience. And you've got to remember that if you're painting really large, and you sell something, well, you're going to have to ship it. And larger paintings are much more expensive to ship, of course. And when you're first starting out and trying to get people to buy anything from you, a size like 11 by 14, 16 by 12, so much easier to ship and less damage involved with any possibility of breakage or other dented corners or anything with your artwork. For me, I package my paintings I sell. I don't sell them in frames. I find that people that are buying paintings like to pick out their own frames to go with their own decor. I buy, basically, they're like pizza boxes or literature boxes that are easily folded into different sizes, and then I can tape those shut. I will wrap the artwork in butcher block type paper or artisan type paper. It's just brown paper. Sometimes you'll use those even for wrapping presents, right? This kind of a thick brown paper, and that works really well. I found it protects the corners well enough, and then with the box surrounding that, it's still pretty light, and I haven't had any major problems. Of course, those are 11 by 14s that I'm talking about. When you get to larger sizes, you'll want to explore how to really get the packaging down so that you're not spending a ton of money on packaging, that you're protecting the artwork, and that make sure that your buyers are paying for the shipping cost, and not, as well as the not just the postage, but the shipping cost, the box that you're using, the paper, the whatever else you're using to make sure that the end product is protected in its journey to the new owner. Here I'm just taking some white on a number 2 round and putting it on very thickly to suggest just a few areas where you would actually see some of the waves coming up, kind of lapping up onto the shore. And if you saw the just to go back a second ago, the cliffs, just a touch of yellow ochre mixed in with a little bit of burnt sienna again. Almost done now, and then I'll be using an eraser to put my name in. Here we go. I want to thank you for watching this video. There'll be another suggestion on a video that you can watch. Click here and you can see that new video. And remember to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Hope that you've learned something in today's video. And I'll be back in about 6 to 7 days, if not sooner, with another video to share with you. Thanks so much.